Hello and welcome to this session on licensing the core infrastructure servers. My name is Simon Taylor and it's my pleasure to take you through these slides. They support the module with the same name in the Microsoft Licensing Solutions Specialist accreditation at getlicensingready.com, and if you need reference material you'll find handouts at that site as well. In this session we'll focus on the two server products that make up the core infrastructure products. That's Windows Server 2016 and System Center 2016. We'll cover all the key licensing information that you need to know about these products, and then we'll look at how organizations can acquire them through mechanisms such as the core infrastructure server suites. Let's start with Windows Server 2016. This is the latest version of Microsoft's server operating system, and it's available in several editions. In this first section, we'll look at the basics of licensing Windows Server 2016. Here are the two editions of Windows Server 2016 that medium and large businesses will deploy. Standard Edition on the left and Datacenter Edition on the right. Let's find out a bit more detail on these editions, and if we compare them, we'll see that the licensing of the two editions is exactly the same. We'll get more detail on the licensing model as we go through this session, but I can tell you at this stage that it's a core-based and CAL licensing model that is used for both editions. And what are the differences between the editions? Well, first of all, they offer different virtualization rights. And again, we'll go into detail on this, but broadly speaking, if an organization has a heavily virtualized infrastructure with many virtual machines, then they would choose Datacenter Edition. And finally, there are some additional features available only in the Datacenter Edition, such as some advanced storage features and shielded virtual machines. Both Standard and Datacenter editions of Windows Server 2016 are licensed with the core-based and CAL model. Let's get a bit more detail on how the licensing works in a typical client-server network. Here you can see that we've got some servers in the middle of the screen which will run Windows Server. We can see the specification of those servers in terms of how many processors and cores they have. Then there are users and devices which will access the services of the server, and you can see that on the left-hand side is a group of users who will use multiple devices to access the server. And on the right-hand side, there are users who will share devices. Finally, there's an external user at the top of the screen. This is a user who doesn't work for the main company. Perhaps he works for a partner or supplier, but he needs access to the server. So, Windows Server will be installed on the servers, and then we need to assign licenses to those physical servers and also to license the users or devices to access the Windows servers. It's the servers that are licensed with a core-based model, and that means that we need to assign licenses to the server based on the number of physical cores. Let's take the server at the right-hand side first. You can see that it has a single processor with 4 cores. For single processor servers, you count the cores and assign that number of licenses whilst making sure that you assign a minimum of 16 licenses to the server. So this server will need 16 licenses. Now let's look at servers with more than one processor, starting at the bottom left where this server has 2 processors, each with 4 cores. Here the rules are that you count the number of cores in the server and assign that number of licenses to the server, whilst making sure that there are a minimum of 8 core licenses assigned to each processor. So this server would require 8 core licenses per processor for a total of 16 licenses again. And the final server has 4 core processors. So following the same rules, 8 licenses will be assigned to each processor for a total of 32 licenses. The users and devices are licensed with CALs, and you probably know that this stands for Client Access License. Organizations can choose between user and device CALs. In this example, we'd probably recommend that the users at the left were licensed with user CALs, since they will be using multiple devices, and that the users at the right are licensed with device CALs. Businesses can mix user and device CALs in this way, but they do need to implement some processes to make sure that they remain compliant and that all users and devices are indeed covered. And what about our external user? Well, we can assign a user or device CAL to him as well. So all of the users and devices that we see here just need one Windows Server CAL to access any of those 3 Windows servers on the network. Another point to note is, if you have mixed versions of Windows Server, then you need to make sure that the CALs are the same or a higher version of the servers that they are accessing. For example, if you had a Windows Server 2008 server, then Windows Server 2016 CALs would be allowed to access that server, but not the other way around. Windows Server 2008 CALs cannot access the higher level, the Windows Server 2016 server. If there are a large number of external users, then it's likely to be cheaper, and it's certainly easier to manage to buy an external connector license rather than individual CALs for users or devices. An external connector license is a single license which is assigned to a server to allow access to that server for external users. You can see here that the top server has the required number of Windows Server 2016 core licenses assigned to it to cover it for Windows Server, and then the external connector license is assigned too. The server has gone purple to show that the external users are allowed access to that particular server. Note, if the external users needed access to all of the servers on our diagram, then you would need to buy an external connector license and assign it to each server. As well as the ordinary Windows Server CAL, which allows access to the services of Windows Server, there are some optional special use CALs which license users to access to certain services in Windows Server. These are RDS, or Remote Desktop Services, and ADRMS, or Active Directory Rights Management Services. Now you can see that they've appeared on the screen with a tick to indicate that there are no more licensing requirements to use these services from a server perspective. You just turn the services on in the server product. However, if the users need to make use of these services, then they do need to be licensed. So, what do these services do? Well, RDS is widely used to allow organizations to run applications on a server for users to access from their desktops, for example. This is great for the IT department to manage and control the applications, and it's popular because of that. ADRMS is about protecting content. So as an example, one user may want to send another an email, but doesn't want that recipient to forward it outside of the organization. ADRMS allows the sender to add some rights management to the email so that it can't be forwarded. And how are these services licensed? Well, there are additional CALs available which an organization should purchase for any users or devices which need to access those particular services. Note that you don't have to license all users and devices as I've shown here. The external user can have CALs assigned to him, or as we saw before, it may be easier and cheaper to assign external connector licenses to a server, and you can see here that 3 external connectors have been assigned to the top server. That's one for the Windows Server base functionality, and then one for RDS and one for ADRMS. You don't need to buy both of the additional external connectors, you buy just what you need. There are certain products that need to be activated when they are installed, and Windows Server is one of those products. Activation validates the software with the manufacturer and confirms it is genuine. A product key is supplied as part of the activation process, which ties a particular instance of the software to a particular device. Rather than members of an IT department having to manually supply activation codes and manage the activation process, there are some options to make the process simpler. The default process is using KMS, which provides a way to automatically activate the software using a KMS server on an organization's internal network. When Windows Server is installed, the server contacts the KMS server and the license is automatically activated. KMS activations are valid for 180 days, and the server will periodically check in with the KMS server to renew the server's activation. Active Directory based activation is an evolution of KMS activation and means that as long as the server can connect to an organization's Active Directory, then it can be activated. Both of these methods we talked about here require connection to an organization's network, and if for some reason this isn't possible, then the last method is required, where a key is manually typed in and the server is activated against Microsoft's activation services. This is a one-time activation, so there is no need to reactivate every 180 days as with the previous 2 methods. The next thing I want to cover with respect to the licensing of Windows Server Standard and Datacenter editions are the downgrade rights that are available. If you look at this slide, you see that today we have just two editions of Windows Server for medium and large businesses, Standard and Datacenter. But in the past there was an Enterprise edition as well. So how do the downgrade rights for Windows Server work? If an organization were to purchase an edition of Windows Server today, what could they install in its place if they needed to? Let's start with the Datacenter edition. And there's a straightforward downgrade right that allows organizations to purchase a Windows Server 2016 Datacenter edition license today, and then to install any previous version of Windows Server Datacenter. So that could be Windows Server 2012 R2, for example. In addition, though, there are down edition rights for Windows Server, and this means that organizations can also install the Enterprise or Standard editions of any version under a Datacenter license. And what about the Standard edition? I think we'd expect that you would be able to install any previous version of Standard edition, and that's indeed the case. What's not so obvious, though, is that Standard edition also allows the installation of any previous version of Enterprise edition as well. Let's now consider the upgrade rights for that customers with active software assurance on their Windows Server 2012 R2 licenses have. Generally speaking, they may upgrade to and use the same edition of Windows Server 2016. So if they had Windows Server 2012 R2 standard licenses, then they're entitled to Windows Server 2016 standard licenses. The licensing model did change between Windows Server 2012 R2 and Windows Server 2016. So how does that work? Well, there are some standard core license grants made. For each Windows Server 2012 R2 processor-based license that the customer has, they are entitled to 16 of the new Windows Server 2016 core licenses. Now, in certain cases, this will mean that a customer does not receive enough licenses, so there are some additional licenses grants where appropriate. The most likely time this is needed is when a customer has a server with more than 8 cores per processor. As an example, if you imagine a server with two 10-core processors, the customer would have bought one Windows Server 2012 R2 processor-based license for this server. And if they just get the standard grant of 16 Windows Server 2016 core licenses, then this clearly isn't enough. They need 20 core licenses. So Microsoft make this additional grant free of charge. And all the customer has to do at the time of software assurance renewal is to keep a record of the actual physical hardware used and the licenses assigned to it. This record must be machine generated, and the Microsoft Software Inventory Login tool or any equivalent software may be used. The final concept to look at in this section is the notion of Windows Server branches, which you may be familiar with from Windows 10 perhaps. A particular branch of the software controls how often security and quality fixes and feature updates are applied. There are two branches for Windows Server, the long-term servicing branch and the current branch for business. Let's look at the long-term servicing branch first. Here you can see that there is a regular cadence, usually monthly, for security and quality fixes, but the feature updates are only available when a new LTSB is released. You can see this flavour of Windows Server is for customers who want a very stable and steady environment, since they get 10 years of support, so they don't need to make an upgrade quickly. Of the three installation options for Windows Server, the long-term servicing branch is available for the desktop experience and server core options. This is different to the current branch for business. There are the same regular updates for security and quality fixes, but the feature updates are made much more regularly, perhaps 2 or 3 times a year, and a customer must be no more than 2 versions behind. Software assurance is required for this branch, and the customer can download the current branch of business software at any time from the Volume Licensing Service Center. This is the branch that is available if a customer opts for the Nano Server installation option, a new option for Windows Server 2016, which allows a customer to optimize their servers by installing a very small Windows Server image and then adding just the roles they need. This is often called the Just Enough OS model. Let's now turn our attention to some more advanced concepts of Windows Server 2016 licensing and look at how Windows Server is licensed in a virtualized environment, within a server farm and in the cloud. Here we see a physical server with two 10-core processors running two virtual machines. We're going to start by looking at the licensing of the Datacenter edition of Windows Server 2016. So what are the rules? Well, if you license the physical server completely, then you can run an unlimited number of virtual machines. For this physical server, we would need to assign 20 core licenses to it. That's 10 for each processor. And we could certainly run the two virtual machines shown, but actually as many as we wanted. Here, we're looking at exactly the same physical server running two virtual machines, but now we'll look at how you license it with Windows Server 2016 Standard Edition. Here are the rules. If you license the physical server completely, then you can run two virtual machines. Again, we'd assign 20 core licenses to the server. But what about when we want to run a further two virtual machines? Well, the rules are that you need to license all the physical servers again to run another two virtual machines. So we'd assign a further 20 core licenses, and now we're licensed to run the 4 virtual machines. Adding further licenses to a server to license additional virtual machines is known as stacking the licenses. Many organizations will start their journey to a virtualized infrastructure by virtualizing just 1 or 2 virtual machines and then building on that. So how does the licensing of Windows Server support moving from a lightly virtualized to a heavily virtualized infrastructure? We've already seen that it's possible to stack Windows Server standard licenses to add capacity as required. And this is great as there's a constant price associated with that method. Alternatively, if an organization has software assurance, then they are eligible to purchase step-up licenses. This means that if they have a standard license with software assurance, then they can move to Datacenter Edition without having to buy brand new Datacenter licenses. They just pay the difference in price of the two licenses and software assurance. As organizations move to a more heavily virtualized environment, it becomes more attractive to license with the Datacenter Edition, of course, since they can run an unlimited number of virtual machines, but also because, perhaps more importantly, they don't need to have processes in place to count the exact number of virtual machines that they are running at any one point in time. So far, we've looked at just one server when we've been considering virtualization licensing for Windows Server. And in reality, of course, organizations have more servers. So let's turn our attention to the licensing of a server farm. Let's start with one server again. And you can see it's a server with two 4-core processors. There is a significant number of virtual machines running on this server. So I think we'd all agree if we had to choose an edition of Windows Server to license this physical server, we choose Datacenter Edition. How many licenses would you assign? Well, we need 16, the minimum of 8 for each processor in this server. Let's now add another identical server to the server farm here. Now this server farm is configured so that the virtual machines may move freely between the physical hosts. Now what licenses do we need for this server? Can the licenses from the first server move across? In fact, they can't. Well, strictly speaking, they could move every 90 days, but that is unlikely to be often enough to support the requirements of this server farm. So we'd need to assign another 16 data center licenses to this server. And the same would be true if we were to add a third server. What this does now mean, though, is that as the virtual machines move around the server farm, we know that wherever they end up, the server farm will be compliant, since all machines are licensed for unlimited virtualization. From a software asset management or SAM perspective, this is really useful, since even if I add another 5 virtual machines to the third server here, everything is still compliant. So one of the key things to take away from this slide is that there is no license mobility with Windows Server. That's the right to move licenses any more frequently than every 90 days. So each server has to be licensed appropriately. On the previous slide, we looked at licensing Windows Server for on-premises virtual machines. Let's now look at licensing Windows Server virtual machines in Azure. There are 2 options for licensing Windows Server virtual machines in Azure. You can pay an hourly cost for a virtual machine, which includes the compute power and the rights to Windows Server, or you can pay a lower cost for a virtual machine that is just the compute power and use your existing Windows Server licenses to license Windows Server in that virtual machine. If organizations have software assurance on their Windows Server licenses, then they are entitled to a benefit called the Azure Hybrid Use Benefit. This is what allows them to use their Windows Server licenses to license Windows Server in virtual machines in Azure. How does this work? Well, for each set of 16 Windows Server core licenses with software assurance, customers may run 2 virtual machines with up to 8 cores each, or one virtual machine with up to 16 cores. Another thing that is important to note is that while the number of virtual machines available to run is the same for Windows Server Standard and Datacenter, there is one difference which we'll look at now. Let's take the first server, which is licensed with Standard Edition. The organization decides to stop running 2 of their virtual machines on premises and moves them to the cloud. They then assign their Windows Server licenses to those virtual machines in Azure. And I think this is how we would expect this benefit to work. You can assign your licenses to either on-premises virtual machines or to Azure virtual machines. This is known as having alternative rights. However, Datacenter is different since it gives additional rights. In other words, the licenses remain assigned to on-premises servers, and organizations may also run and license virtual machines in Azure. Here an organization moves 2 virtual machines to Azure, and they don't need to reassign the licenses. Let's turn our attention now to the editions of Windows Server 2016 that a smaller business is likely to choose. You can see I've included the standard edition of Windows Server that we've already covered, as well as another edition, Essentials Edition. In terms of how these editions are licensed, we already know that the standard edition is a license with a core based in CAL model, but the Essentials Edition requires a server license only. Let's get a bit more detail on how this works now. So, the Essentials Edition just requires a server license. However, there are a couple of restrictions associated with this edition, where you can see that it is limited to run on a server with up to 2 processors, and then up to 25 users or 50 devices may connect to the server with no further licensing requirements. Note that this is a hard limit rather than a recommendation, so this edition really is aimed at a small business. Virtualization is also supported, and the license allows the software to run in a single physical or virtual operating system environment. Let's move on to the second main section of this session and look at the licensing of System Center 2016, Microsoft's management tools. This slide shows a typical deployment of System Center. In the middle, there's the management server. That's where the System Center management tools will be installed and where the IT professional would use a console to view all devices that the management server is managing. And these devices could be servers on the left-hand side or clients which you can see on the right-hand side. From a licensing perspective, all the devices, often called the endpoints, that are being managed, need to have a management license or ML assigned to them. If it's a client, then a client ML is required, and if it's a server, then a server ML is required. The System Center 2016 server management licenses are available in 2 editions. You can see that here, Standard and Datacenter. And we know that these are assigned to servers that need to be managed. In the past, you would have assigned a System Center Config Manager Server ML to a machine if you wanted to manage it with Configuration Manager, or an Ops Manager Server ML if you wanted to manage it with Operations Manager. Today, if you assign a System Center 2016 Server ML, it includes all of the System Center 2016 components. When a System Center Server ML is assigned to a server, any workloads can be managed. In the past, different licenses were required depending on what workloads the server was running. Today, it's much simpler. The third thing to note on this slide is that no separate licenses are required for the management server software. Do you remember the diagram on the previous slide that showed the management server in the middle? Although software is installed on that server, the rights to do so are included in the server MLs. That management server software relies on SQL Server, and the rights to use that are also given via the server MLs. And finally, it's important to note that these System Center server MLs are only available with software assurance. We know that there are standard and data center editions of the System Center 2016 server MLs, but what we don't know yet is how they differ from each other. Actually, the difference is just in the licensing of virtual machines. Now, if you were happy with the Windows Server licensing that we covered earlier, you're in good shape to understand the licensing of System Center because it's exactly the same. Let me show you as we consider licensing the server that you can see on the slide at the moment with System Center Datacenter Edition. This is a physical server with 2 10-core processors, and currently it has 2 virtual machines running on it. From a management point of view, we want to assign server MLs to that physical server that will allow us to manage this virtual servers running on it. The licensing is exactly the same as Windows Server 2016. So if we license the physical server completely, then we're allowed to manage an unlimited number of virtual machines. In this case, assigning 20 server MLs to the physical server would allow the management of all these virtual machines. And the licensing of System Center 2016 Standard Edition is exactly the same as Windows Server 2016 too. So let's have a recap. Again, I first of all want to manage 2 virtual machines, and the rules state that if we license the physical server completely, then we can manage 2 virtual machines. So I assign 20 server MLs to the server. And for further virtual machines, again the rules are the same. So I license the physical server again, and I can manage another 2 virtual machines. Let's now turn our attention to some of the SA benefits that System Center customers are entitled to, starting with upgrade rights. This slide will look very familiar to you, because it's exactly the same as we saw for Windows Server 2016, where each System Center 2012 R2 processor-based license is entitled to a grant of 16 System Center core MLs, unless a record is kept of why an additional grant should be made. We saw that there is no license mobility for Windows Server 2016. Licenses cannot be moved from one physical server to another in an on-premises server farm any more frequently than every 90 days. And that is the same for System Center 2016 too. As far as the cloud went, we saw that Windows Server 2016 licenses with active software assurance may be used to license virtual machines in Azure, and although that Azure hybrid use benefit doesn't exist for System Center 2016, it does have license mobility through software assurance. This means that organizations can use their existing licenses to manage virtual machines in the cloud. Note that this is an alternative right. You assign the licenses to on-premises servers or ones in the cloud. Note also that the Azure hybrid use benefit applies only to the Azure cloud, but this license mobility through SA benefit applies to any public cloud. If we return to our diagram that showed us the licensing requirements for System Center 2016, then we've covered the left-hand side, which is licensing the servers with MLs. So it's now time to turn our attention to the right-hand side and understand how the client MLs are assigned. With the server MLs, we saw that you purchased the required number of a single license, System Center 2016 server MLs, and the server to which the core licenses are assigned is licensed for all the different components of System Center 2016. Now, this isn't the case with the client MLs. They are available as individual components. Here you can see the licenses that an organization can actually purchase either as standalone components or for some of them in the Core Cal suite. As with the server MLs, when an organization purchases clients MLs, they get rights to the management server software and SQL Server to support it. And from a licensing perspective, these client MLs are available licensed per operating system environment or per user. And as with the server MLs, software assurance is included. In this last section of this session, let's turn our attention to the core infrastructure server suites. The core infrastructure server suites are a great way for customers to acquire licenses for 2 products. That's System Center 2016 and of course Windows Server 2016. There are 2 suites available. It's a standard suite, which includes the standard editions of both products, and a data center suite, which includes the data center editions of both products. We saw through this session how the licensing model for these products is identical, and this follows through to the suites, where again the model is based on the number of cores in the server hardware. And if the core infrastructure server suites are used in a virtualized infrastructure, then the same virtualization rules apply too, with data center licenses allowing unlimited virtual machines when the physical server is completely licensed, and standard licenses covering 2 virtual machines. There are 2 ways of acquiring licenses for the core infrastructure server suites. They can only be acquired through the volume licensing programs, but they can be acquired through any of the programs, and there's no minimum license purchase. As well as making it convenient to buy these licenses together, there's a price advantage as well, since the suite attracts a 5% discount over buying the products separately. Then, for the customer who wants to commit to the core infrastructure server suites across their whole installed base of Windows Server servers, there's a possibility of buying the licenses through the server and cloud enrollment. There's a minimum requirement of 400 core licenses of either suite to sign the enrollment, and in return for this commitment across the whole estate, there are discounts of approximately 20% compared to buying standalone Windows Server and System Center licenses. That brings us to the end of this session on the licensing of the core infrastructure, Windows Server 2016 and System Center 2016. Your next step is to go and take the online exam and continue working towards the MLSS accreditations. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I wish you the very best of luck when you take the associated exam.